Welcome back to All This Math. This is Professor Parker, and today we're going to talk about the midpoint formula. All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about the midpoint formula. I should say another day I did another video about the midpoint formula, but in that other video, I was talking about how to find the midpoint when you know two endpoints. For example, if you have a line segment, right, it goes like this, and you know what this is. Let's say that's point A. And you know what that is, and that's point B. And let's say you knew the coordinates of point A and point B. And you want to know, okay, well, what's the halfway point? We don't know. We can use the midpoint formula to figure that out, right? But sometimes this happens. You know the midpoint, and you know one of the endpoints, but the other endpoint you don't know. So sometimes you're missing one of the endpoints. But we can use the same midpoint formula to figure out what the missing endpoint is. All right? We just have to use a little bit of algebra, and the math is a little more tricky. Well, I shouldn't say tricky. The math is a little more involved than what the math is like when we're trying to find just what the midpoint is when we know the two endpoints. So keep that in mind. Sometimes we use the midpoint formula to just find the midpoint when we know the two endpoints. We want to know the midpoint. Sometimes we use the midpoint formula to find the other endpoint when we know one endpoint and the midpoint. All right? So again, sometimes we use the midpoint formula to find the midpoint. That's what we use it for. Sometimes we use the midpoint formula when we already know the midpoint, but we're trying to find one of the endpoints. Because you know, you always use the midpoint formula when you have a line segment that's got one end and another end. So from end to end, right? But this is what it looks like. Let's take a look at the information we're given. We're told to find the missing endpoint. Find the missing endpoint. All right? So one of our endpoints is 2, 6. So what I want to do is, I'm still going to try to label what's my x1, what's my y1, and this is going to be my x1 and my y1. So I'm going to say, okay, x1 equals 2. Now, what's x2? We'll talk about that in a second. What's y1? Y1 is 6, because remember, x1 always goes with y1. So if x1 is 2, y1 is 6. So now, here's my question. What's x2 and y2? I don't know. That's not it, because that's the midpoint. That's the midpoint. Don't get it confused. This is the midpoint. This is not x2 and y2. That's not what this is. x2 and y2 is the other endpoint. x1 and y1 is one endpoint. x2 and y2 is the other endpoint. We don't know the other endpoint. That's the whole purpose of doing this problem, so we can figure out what the other endpoint is. All right? So don't get it confused. You do know what the midpoint is. You do know what the midpoint is, right? So when I go to my midpoint formula, this is what I'm going to do. Now pay careful attention, right? And like I said, you might want to pause the video and copy the midpoint formula down. You might want to do that if you need to. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the coordinates for the midpoint, or I should say I'm going to replace this letter M, which represents midpoint, with the coordinates for the endpoint. Or no, the coordinates for the midpoint, excuse me. The coordinates for the midpoint. I'm going to replace this letter M right here. So I'm going to just say -4, 3, and then I'm going to say over here, I'm going to replace whatever numbers I can, or whatever letters I can. I know what x1 is, so that means I don't need to write x1. I can replace x1 with a 2. So I can write 2 plus x2 divided by 2. Then I write a comma. And then y1 is 6, so I replace y1 with a 6. I got 6 plus y2 divided by 2. Right? So that's what I have there. I had 2 plus x2 over 2, and I have 6 plus y2 over 2. Right? Now watch this. Now the next part is, you may want to put this in your notes. You're going to create two separate equations. You're going to create two separate equations. Now I'm going to show you what these equations are going to look like. I need an equation for my x values. So in my midpoint, this -4 is an x value. The first number is always the x value. So endpoints have x values, and the midpoint has an x value. So watch this. I'm going to write -4 equals this part right here. This part right here. First number, first part. First number, first part. The first number matches up with the first part inside the parentheses. So I'm going to have 2 plus x2 over 2. That's my first equation that I set up. That should be your first equation. All right. And again, if at any point you need to pause the video, feel free. Pause the video and copy down what you need to. Okay. Rewind it if something doesn't make sense. Hopefully I've explained it previously. Now, let's set up our second equation. This 3 is the y value of the midpoint. So this 3 is actually equal to the second part inside the parentheses, because this is the information that you'll use to figure out what the y value of the midpoint is. So then it should make sense that this 3 is equal to this information right here. So my other equation is going to be 3 equals 6 plus y2 divided by 2. These are my two equations that I'm going to use to find the coordinates of the other endpoint. These are my two equations. Just follow what I do step by step. This -4. Now, how do I know -4 is part of the midpoint? Because I read the original problem. It says midpoint is -4, 3. That means -4, 3 represents the coordinates of the midpoint. Now, in the equation, the first part of the equation represents the x value of the midpoint. The second part of this equation represents the y value of the midpoint. So all you got to do is just say, okay, well, -4 is my x, so that should be equal to the first part of the equation. +3 is my y, so that should be equal to the second part of the equation. All right? Now we got to solve. Now, we solve these in 2 steps, just 2 steps. The first step, and you should probably write this down, cross multiply. Whatever's in the denominator gets multiplied by that number right there. That's always going to be your first step in these particular problems. So 2 times -4, that equals -8. I write the -8 in the place of where the -4 was at. Then I write this numerator over again, 2 plus x2. So that's my first step. I cross multiply. 2 times -4. I cross multiply. 2 times -4 gave me -8. And then that's equal to this numerator, 2 plus x2. Now, I'm solving for x2. So I need to eliminate this 2 right here. So I want to get this x2 by itself. So I want to get rid of this 2. The opposite of a +2 is a -2. So that means my next and last step is subtract 2. Subtract 2 on the right side. Subtract 2 on the left side. -8 minus 2. Be very careful with how we add and subtract negative numbers. -8 minus 2. Whenever you subtract, you move to the left on the number line. So that means that if you start out right here at -8, if it's subtracting, you're going to the left 2 spaces. So you go to -9, -10. This is not -6. It's not +6. It's not +10. -8 minus 2 is -10. So -10 equals x2. That's our x value from our midpoint. No, I keep messing that up. That's our x value from our end point. That's our x value from our end point, -10. Now, we're going to do the same thing over here with this equation. Remember the 2 steps. We cross multiply, and then we add or subtract to get rid of the other number. So think about it like this. Cross multiply, get rid of the other number. Cross multiply, get rid of the other number. I'm going to write it over here. I'm going to put CM for cross multiply and get rid of other number. So you cross multiply and get rid of the other number. So I cross multiply, multiply 2 times 3. I go diagonal. 2 times 3 is 6. And then we have 6 plus y2. 6 equals 6 plus y2. And then I want to solve for y2, so I got to get rid of the other number. The other number is 6. The opposite of a +6 is a -6. So that means that I need to subtract 6. Subtract 6 right here. Subtract 6 right here. 6 minus 6 is 0. 6 minus 6 is 0. So 0 equals y2. So now for my endpoint, I know what my x value is, and I know what my y value is. I know what my x value is. I know what my y value is. So therefore, the way I write my coordinate is the same way you write this one or this one. X goes first, y goes second. So I write it like this. Parentheses, -10, and 0. That's the coordinates of the other endpoint. So that's what x2 and y2 would be. And every problem that you do like this is the same. It's done the same exact way. No matter what the numbers are. No matter what the numbers are, it's done the same way. Now, if this is confusing, that's because you probably never saw it before. Expect it to be confusing at first. Now the thing for you to do in order to get your proficiency up is to do a bunch of examples. Do a bunch of practice and a bunch of examples where you follow the same exact steps every time. The same exact steps every time. You need the repetition. That's the only way to learn anything in math. Repetition. All right? Identify what your x1 and y1 is. Write your formula down. Put the numbers that you know where they belong. Set up your two equations. Equation 1, equation 2. Equation 1, equation 2. Solve each equation. That's how you get the answers. You solve each equation. Cross multiply is your first step, and then you get rid of the other number by doing the opposite operation. In case you're wondering, how do you know that you're supposed to subtract 2? This is how you know. You always do the opposite operation. If you have a positive 2, that's like saying plus 2. What's the opposite of adding a 2? Subtracting a 2. If this was a negative, then you would do the opposite of a negative number. The opposite of a negative number is a positive number. So you would do addition to get rid of it. You always do the opposite operation to get rid of the number. All right? And you do the same thing in this equation over here. All right? So I hope that was helpful. Please like the video, share the video with somebody else. Let people know what we're doing over here, all this math. Please subscribe to the page if you haven't already. And always remember, there's all this math all around you.